Beef and politics, there's a lot going on there right now. We've got ranchers who are actually speaking out against Trump, unlike soy farmers to this day are still kind of cowering the corner going, no, don't hit me again. Beef ranchers are actually getting in it. Trump is talking about bringing in beef from Argentina. We've got record high beef prices here in the US. What on earth is going on? A lot. There's a lot going on here. I thought it would be nice to take a moment to just sit down and unpack some of the things that are happening, because the hijinks and shenanigans that are going on in the beef industry right now are a perfect window into how the conservative and MAGA coalition works, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the ways that it can and cannot change going forward into the future. So let's dig into it. There's a few different things going on here that we gotta unpack to make sense of what's going on with beef. To start with, why are beef ranchers having such a different reaction to Trump's threats to their industry compared to especially, say, soy farmers who are not really putting up much of a fight at all? Why are beef ranchers so different? We'll talk about that. Second, we need to unpack why beef is so expensive right now in the US. There's the part that everybody knows about. That's monopoly power with the beef packers. But that's only part of it. We're going to get into some of the other reasons. Spoiler, cattle cycle. And then we need to talk about the obvious solution to this monopoly power problem, that is trust busting, and why nobody in the beef industry wants to do it. It's not just beef packers who are scared of trust busting. It's also companies like McDonald's that buy lots and lots of beef. They're suffering because of beef packers' monopoly power, but they don't want trust busting, for obvious reasons. I'm going to speak very carefully here. You'll hear ranchers talk a lot about how we need to do trust busting, but when you look at the decisions they actually make, with their votes, with their money, it is not going towards politicians who will trust bust. The ways that beef ranchers and these food companies are both trying to get around the beef packers in their own interesting ways can tell us so much about how food, economics, and politics in this country actually work, but nobody who reports on those things is really talking about it. That's what I like to do on this channel. I like to dive into the big, important stories in food, politics, agriculture, economics that no one else is talking about because they just don't know that they're there. Sometimes when you want to tell stories about agriculture, you just kind of have to know what you're talking about. There's three things that are different between soy and beef farmers. One, half-ish of the US soy crop is exported. I think half just to China. They've already lost their market and they're like, oh God, I need it back. They're already in a bad position. Whereas beef ranchers are actually making money right now because more of their market is in the US. With soy, there's way more supply than there is demand right now, so their prices have plummeted. Whereas with beef, there's way more demand for beef than there is supply in the US right now, so beef prices are actually good. There's also twice as many ranchers in the US as there are soy farmers, so politically it's a little bit more of a potent force. If you've been following the farm news, you know that beef ranchers are really upset with Trump and are not shy about telling him that. Whereas, for example, soy farmers are kind of cowering the corner going, no, don't hit me again. That's a big difference. What's going on here? So I want to be clear, this is not two totally different groups of people. There are a lot of folks who both raise soybeans and raise cattle, but the economics of beef and soybeans are just very different right now. Soy is a crop where about half of the US crop at least is exported overseas, right? So because of the trade war, they can't sell soybeans, which means now supply in the US is way higher than demand, and so the price for soybeans has plummeted. So if you're growing soybeans, you're just in a real bad place right now, and you need Trump to solve it. You need him to stop the trade war. So that's why they are in a position of asking for help, right? Whereas for beef ranchers, they don't have this problem where they lost an export market because they were just selling it in the US to start with. Also, unlike soy, beef prices are actually good right now for reasons we'll get into shortly. It's not that often that beef ranchers actually make a good amount of money, but right now is one of those times and they're really feeling themselves. So beef ranchers already have a good thing going right now, and the actions Trump is taking, talking about importing Argentine beef, threatens to make those good times stop. So beef ranchers are in a very different position where they're defending something good that they already have right now, whereas soy farmers are already in a lot of trouble and begging for help to get out of it. Okay, so now we need to talk about why beef prices in the US are so high right now. There's the reason that everybody knows about, that is beef cartels. Basically monopoly power for the beef packers. There's four main beef packing companies in the US right now. It's JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and National Beef. These four companies control 80 to 85% of the US beef supply. That is enough concentration to allow these companies to behave like monopolies, even though there's four of them. So one reason beef prices are so high right now is beef cartels. But it's only one reason. There's at least two more. One more reason beef prices are high right now is called screwworm. Did a couple videos on this. This is a parasite that is gross. It's a fly that lays its eggs on cattle in a wound or something like that, and then the maggots grow in the flesh. Screwworm is native to the United States, but it was eradicated because it caused a lot of problems for cattle and also people and pets. However, screwworm is making a comeback. Screwworm has made its way into Mexico, and to slow it down or keep it from reaching the US at all, the US has blocked shipping in cattle from Mexico or made it a lot harder to do that. It takes a long time, there's inspections, that's going to add to the costs. Now, usually when beef prices are high in the US, we solve a lot of that by bringing up cattle from Mexico, and that supply is basically cut off or really restricted right now. So that lack of additional supply that we usually have access to from Mexico is helping keep US beef prices high. By the way, if you're liking this video, if you feel like you're learning something, go ahead and give it a like, a subscribe, a comment. Those things really do help the video get in front of more people and get the word out. Thanks for watching. The third reason beef is expensive right now is a little something called the cattle cycle. The cycle of cows. So what is the cattle cycle? Well, the price of cattle, like you're about to send them to the slaughterhouse to turn into beef, the price of those cattle fluctuates up and down on about a 10 to 11, sometimes up to 15-year cycle. It's actually really predictable. We have charts showing it happening all the way back to at least the 1960s. So why does the beef cycle happen and why is it so predictable? Say you're a beef rancher. Every year you've got a crop of calves. You have to decide how many of those calves you're going to sell for cash this year and how many you might want to keep back and perhaps build your herd to a greater size. If I'm a beef rancher making that decision and prices are high right now, I'm probably going to keep back fewer of my calves on my ranch and I'm going to sell more of them to take advantage of those high prices right now. Because as a rancher, I know that high prices can be pretty temporary. But if the price of cattle has stayed high for a couple of years, I might start thinking, maybe I'm going to hang on to those calves and build up my herd because I'm seeing that now cattle are more valuable than they have been in the past. These are a better investment now. I'm going to hang on to them. So the more ranchers keep back their calves, the higher the price of cattle grows. So the more motivated people are to keep more and more of their calves. And you get a feedback loop where the price of cattle keeps growing, but that actually makes people want to sell their cattle less because they're a good long-term investment now. That is, by the way, roughly where in the cattle cycle we've been for the last several months. Eventually that does hit a breaking point. The price of cattle gets so high that people have been holding back cattle start realizing, actually, I am going to sell. And they start sending all these cattle they've been holding back out into the market. That's why they call it a cattle cycle. One step will lead naturally to the next. That tends to happen about 2 years from when people see that prices are high and start holding their cattle back. That's how long it takes for those calves to reach maturity and start having calves of their own. You would think that once the cattle price starts to drop, people would just hang on to their cattle and try to ride out the period of low prices. And that is exactly what people do for a while. The problem is, if you grew your herd expecting high prices, that means you probably have a little bit more cattle than your land can actually support. You expected that high prices would mean you can afford to buy hay, but prices have collapsed. And so you don't have the money to keep all these cows around anymore. So you got to start selling them off. So as soon as the price for cattle starts crashing, you actually have more and more and more cattle come to the market as people are trying to cut their losses and cut their herds down. That's the bottom of the cattle cycle. That's usually when you'll start to see news about ranches are struggling. Beef prices are very, very low. It's really interesting to me how this cattle cycle keeps happening because everyone who's been in the beef industry for multiple generations knows what it is and that it's going to happen. But the incentives of the market are such that unless you really build your family business around not getting trapped in it, you will still get trapped in it. And so that still keeps happening to a lot of people. Now, once the prices have been low for a couple of years, you'll have so many people who sold off so much of their herd or got out of ranching completely that the supply of cattle will drop and the price will start to creep back up. And that's the cattle cycle for you. And we are currently in the part where beef is really expensive. We might have just turned or be about to turn the corner right now to where prices start to drop again, but we are currently at the part of the cattle cycle where ranchers get paid the most. So they're feeling themselves right now. They're feeling like everything is working out for them, and why would you mess with that? So that's why beef ranchers are talking back at Trump. They're actually having a good time for once and don't want anybody to ruin it. All right, so we've got our big 3 reasons that beef is expensive right now, right? We've got our beef cartels. Screwworm means it's a lot tougher to tap into our traditional backup supply of cattle from Mexico. And we're at the top of the cattle cycle. Screwworm and the cattle cycle are just biology. They're just gonna take time. The high prices that come from monopolies and cartels can be fixed by trust busting, and the federal government has the power to do that, but it won't. And this is where things get interesting. Now, the US government has announced that it's going to investigate beef packers for overcharging and for monopoly practices. However, these investigations often lead nowhere, and it's not hard to imagine why government officials can be so slow to do trust busting. One of the big 4 beef packers, JBS, donated $5 million to Trump in his last campaign. And that's usually where the conversation ends. Our government doesn't do trust busting on these big monopolies and cartels because they donate to major political figures and that makes them untouchable. But believe it or not, there is way more to this story. Because when beef packers get to behave like monopolies, it's not just the little guys getting screwed. Every company that buys lots of food is in the same boat. And that's why major food companies like McDonald's, Aldi, Target, Sodexo, BJ's Wholesale, and more have been suing the major beef packers in the last few years and winning huge settlements. McDonald's is the biggest beef buyer in the US, if not the world, and they don't even have the power in the marketplace to get a fair contract with these beef companies. So you would think these major companies would want to pressure the US government to trust bust. You would think they would do that, but they don't. And you can imagine why. These are large companies, and so their leadership might be afraid that if the government gets a taste for trust busting, if they manage to do it successfully and everyone claps, then there will be more, and they could be next on the list. So these are major players in the beef market that are getting screwed by this cartel behavior, but they do not want trust busting to happen. What they're doing instead is just suing the beef packers every few years and getting a big settlement, and I guess maybe that pencils out. These major food companies are getting hurt by this cartel behavior, but at the end of the day, the food companies and the beef cartels mostly want the same thing. They want a pro-business government with few regulations and low taxes. And that's why they are generally all in that conservative coalition, being very, very friendly bedfellows, even though they are constantly at conflict over the price of beef. The food companies are not letting this fairly petty disagreement over the price of beef escalate into, we're going to break from you politically and start supporting trust busting. Instead of going that far, what they're doing instead is, we're going to settle this through lawsuits. We're going to sue you for a few dozen $1 million. We're going to get that settlement perhaps out of court, so we minimize the legal fees. Everyone walks away happy, that is, except for consumers, who still have to pay these elevated prices at the grocery store, and we don't get paid back when the food companies win those lawsuits. Just the food companies. Same thing for ranchers. There are some ranching groups that have done lawsuits against the beef packers as well, but most ranchers are not getting payouts from that either. Now let's talk about ranchers' side of things and this whole dispute over control of the beef industry and who gets to set the prices and how. Ranchers have been making noise about what a problem it is to be up against beef cartels for decades, and I'm going to speak very carefully here. If you look at how ranchers talk about how we need to take on these cartels, and where they actually put their political energy, their donations, and their votes, these are telling two very different stories. And that's another thing we should get to the bottom of. Something you have to understand about ranching is poor people can't afford to do it. I know that flies in the face of everything we're told about ranchers. They're just poor, struggling little guys, but that is the reality. It really helps to have enough space for it and be able to afford a vet and all the food, and that'll give you an idea of the ballast in life it takes to financially be able to handle raising cattle. There have actually been a couple times recently in social media where a poor, struggling rancher was featured, and if you just watch what they're actually talking about, you can tell that guy's not poor at all. It was so crazy because he's talking in the 1 or 2 TikToks that went viral about how he lost a lot of money to Doge. He can't afford this and he doesn't know what he's going to do. And then a couple TikToks later,
I have definitely sat down, ran some numbers on it. I figured out how we are going to overcome the obstacles that we have faced due to these executive orders being signed and the IRA funds being frozen. I will make it work. It will be a financial struggle for me for a while, but I will make it work. I will not lose this farm.
What kind of person can just fool around with their books for a couple days and find a spare $80,000? There were so many people on the internet going, oh, I feel so bad for this guy. You know, when people say listen to farmers, this is also part of it. I really feel like we need to pay more attention to how much they're actually telling us about their financial position and how it's not poverty. More Perfect Union also did a feature in the last year or two. They found this poor, struggling rancher and talked about how bad he had it, and he was losing money on his cattle and he was thinking about ending it all.
Coy has a side business running a barbecue catering company, and he's transitioning to that full time.
As you go through the video, he just kind of casually mentions, oh yeah, I have this other business covering the fact that I'm losing money on the cattle, and they just did not pick up on that at all somehow. Like, it's in the video, and they never mention he can afford to lose money on cattle. It's happening right in front of you, and the people making the video never even notice. This kind of thing happens all the time when we talk about farmers in the news. Poor people can't afford to raise cattle. There are certainly people who raise cattle who are not as wealthy as they wish they were, and so they may self-identify as poor. But if you actually take down their numbers and you look at all the equipment and everything they have and how they've chosen to spend their money, poor people simply cannot do what they're doing. When we talk about farmers and ranchers in US politics, we talk a lot about how it's important to meet people where they're at. And I would say absolutely that's true. I agree 100%. And that starts with knowing where they're at. So we need to talk about ranchers and money. Now there's another really interesting thing about ranchers. About 80% of them are very small. They have 50 cows or fewer. So 80% of the ranchers in the US, we're talking 50 or fewer cows. Now, how much you make per cow when you sell them can vary a lot. But we'll say in a very, very average kind of year, we're talking about $1,000 per animal. So if you have 50 cows, and all of them have a calf, and you sell 50 calves successfully, you don't lose a single one, and you sell them all for $1,000, that's $50,000 before you've even taken out any expenses. So the most money you could possibly be making from raising calves like this in a very small herd is $50,000 a year before expenses. That's not a living wage. That's not a real salary. And I know most people are instantly going to go, oh my God, that's why they're poor. No, they've got multiple streams of income that are covering the cost of having these cattle. It's a very small herd, so you also can't lose too much money on it. That's the other perk of a small herd. So of course we ask ourselves, why are people out there raising cattle when they cannot possibly make a living doing it? And the answer is because they like having cows. Any way you slice it, that's the answer. In a lot of cases, you have a farm that's raising a lot of other things and they have a small cattle herd just to kind of balance things out. I knew a guy who said, yeah, my dad raises a bunch of corn and soy and then he's got a herd of 20 cows just to give him something to do every day. You know, he's got to go out, feed them, check on them. So you have a very real farmer who's raising a few beef cattle basically just because he wants to. You also, in other cases, have a lot of families who own land and who need to put that land to some kind of agricultural use, or they'll have to pay a full property tax on it. So they're looking to do anything they can just to avoid paying property taxes, and in many cases, beef cattle are just the best fit for that. Beef cattle are pretty hands-off compared to a lot of things. Depending on how you raise them, sometimes you have to be out with them every day. In other cases, you can just kind of like let them go, you know, off into a field for a week, sometimes months, depending on how you've got your place set up. So raising beef cattle can be very hands-off, and it appeals to a lot of people for that reason. If you have land that you don't want to pay property taxes on, so you need to farm something there to get a farm tax break, and you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to it, beef cattle are often the answer to that problem because they're hands-off. And then you get into your just straight-up real estate speculation situations where somebody will buy a plot of rural land, wait for it to appreciate in value, and again, they need to collect a tax break, so they'll still raise cattle on it or have somebody else raise cattle on it so they can get those property tax breaks. Beef ranching is popular for a lot of reasons. A lot of people really like doing it. If you do have a larger operation, you can make money, but the sheer number of small beef ranches we have in the US cannot be explained just through folks trying to make a living by raising beef cattle. So just in general, beef ranchers do tend to be people of some means. They're more likely to own a business, they're more likely to own property, maybe a lot of property. That's why they tend to be into conservative politics as well. I've done whole videos on this, we don't need to get into it right now, but the important thing to know here is that it's not traditional social values that brings them to conservatism, it's just business values. Conservative politics promise farmers and ranchers something that progressives can never offer. That is low taxes. That is minimal labor laws. That is minimal consumer protection laws and minimal environmental laws. So again, when it comes to meeting people where they're at, it is so important to understand where they're actually at. Ranchers and beef packers are in disagreement about how much those ranchers should get paid for their cattle, but they're in line on pretty much everything else. We don't want labor laws. We don't want environmental protection laws. We don't want consumer protection laws. We don't want labor laws. They're all very much in agreement on those things. And that's what keeps them all together in that conservative political coalition. So some beef ranchers sometimes will make a lot of noise about how we should do something about the beef monopolies. But there's never a real critical mass to do something about it. There's no political will to either push the GOP to take action or to defect to another party that might be more proactive about trust busting. You know how those food companies have their alternative to trust busting? Instead of pushing for trust busting, we're just going to sue the beef packers every once in a while and get our money back from them. Well, ranchers have their own alternative too. You know how there's been a lot of talk lately about how we need more small local meat processing plants, small local slaughterhouses? Yeah, that's ranchers' alternative to trust busting. The small local slaughterhouse idea is basically a way for people who raise cattle to try and get paid more without having to actually challenge the power of the big four beef processors, without having to take them to court and do trust busting. Because it's one thing to sell a few cows to a local slaughterhouse and get paid a little bit more. It's another thing to actually cost those guys a lot of money and maybe risk some of their wrath. So here's the problem with that. Small local slaughterhouses will never fix this problem. And here's why. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the logistics and scale of animal slaughter and butchery, but scale really does matter here. So here's the thing you need to know about large-scale slaughterhouses. A lot of the time, they don't make their money selling meat. They sell that basically at break even. These slaughterhouses make their money on the byproducts, selling the hides to leather processors and melting down and cooking down the rest of the animal into glue, fertilizer, and other byproducts. That's how these slaughterhouses actually make their money. The beef is kind of a byproduct of that, actually. Now, if you're a small local slaughterhouse that's processing 10 or 20 or 100 cattle a day, you're just not going to have enough volume of hides and other byproducts to make it worth it. You are not going to be able to make your money on the byproducts. And so these smaller slaughterhouses will always have to make their money actually selling the beef. They're just going to have to charge more money for beef than these larger slaughterhouses. That's just the way the logistics pencil out. And that means the small local slaughterhouses are not a solution. They will not take market power away from the cartels. What they do, and all they do, is give ranchers a way to sell some animals at a higher price. And that's fine for fixing some of ranchers' problems, but they cannot solve the bigger food system problem, which is that we're still going to have four companies basically controlling the beef supply. Now, the last solution to our beef problem is Trump's proposal of bringing in beef from Argentina, imports. And once you start looking at the political economics of why, it's really obvious. Importing beef from Argentina is a temporary solution. It doesn't take real guts. You don't have to take on the meat cartels. The idea is, well, I guess we can just bring in some extra beef, add competition, and drop the price quickly. So consumers will get off my my back about how grocery prices are going up and I never have to actually fix anything. It's also maybe a nice way to funnel some money towards Argentina and help bail out his buddy Malay. That's always nice for him, I guess. So to wrap this all up, if you have had questions about what on earth is going on with beef, why are the prices so high, why are we talking about imports, what is going on, now you have way too much information at your fingertips to answer all those questions. And it's also a really good inside look at what actually happens inside agriculture, and it also gives some insight into why conservative politics in the US work the way they do. I've seen so many people just act baffled. They can't understand why farmers keep voting conservative and keep supporting the politics of big business, even though they're always complaining about how big business is screwing them. Once you understand the economics of what's actually going on in here, it's not that hard to figure out. Everyone in the food and farm business is struggling with these cartels, just like consumers, but they also benefit from a lot of the same things that the cartels do, so they don't want to get rid of those policies. So everyone in the food and agriculture sector, instead of going for trust busting, is just building themselves life rafts and off ramps, so they don't have to deal with the consequences of cartels for them. They don't actually want to get rid of cartels, they just want a little escape valve for themselves. That is how all these players in the farm and food sector who are getting screwed by these monopolies are managing to stay in the same political fellowship as those monopolies, and all manage to still be friends. That might have been too much of a deep dive, but I know folks have had some questions, and I mean, it's not simple. We kind of have to get into it. So if you're still watching, I really appreciate you trusting me with your time, and I hope you got something good out of it. Y'all do good out there.